The first rule of the night watch is simple. If you hear your name spoken in the dark, do not answer. Most men learn that one quickly. Some learn it their first night. Others learn it later, when there is no one left to tell them why the rule exists in the first place. I learned it before I ever put on the cloak. London changes when the sun goes down. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It settles. The noise thins first, carts rattling less often, voices lowering, doors closing one by one. Then the smell shifts, smoke becoming heavier as fires are banked for the night, refuse cooling in the alleys where it has been thrown. By the time the bells mark the final hour before curfew, the city no longer belongs to its people. It belongs to those who remain awake. I have walked the streets of London at night for many years. I know the sound of honest footsteps. I know the difference between a drunk and a man pretending to be one. I know how fog moves when it is only fog, and when it is something else. I am not important. I am not brave. I am careful. That is why I am still walking. The night watch exists for practical reasons. Fires spread quickly in a city like this. Thieves move more freely in darkness. Gates must be guarded. Curfews enforced. Those are the reasons written down. The rules we actually follow are different. Rule 1. Never begin your watch late. You must take to the streets while there is still some argument left in the light. If you arrive after darkness has fully settled, the city has already arranged itself without you. Streets learn their shapes early in the night. Once that happens, correcting them is difficult. A late watchman walks more, sees less, and ends up somewhere he cannot explain. I always begin my watch before the final bell. Always. Rule to count the bells yourself. Do not trust that they have been rung correctly. London is measured by bells. They tell us when to close the gates, when to put out fires, when the watch begins and ends. Every watchman knows the sound of each bell in his district. If you hear a bell you do not recognize, do not repeat it. If you hear the right bell at the wrong hour, do not adjust your route. Bells do not make mistakes. People do. Rule 3. Walk the same route in the same order every night. The streets remember patterns. If you vary your route too often, you teach them to rearrange themselves for you. That is how alleys stretch longer than they should. That is how doors appear where there were none before. Consistency keeps the city predictable. Predictability keeps you alive. Most men think these rules are superstition. They laugh when they hear them for the first time. They say, the city is brick and timber, not a living thing. They say streets do not move. They are correct. Streets do not move, but they do settle. Rule 4. Never turn round immediately when you hear footsteps behind you. This one is taught gently. Footsteps echo strangely at night. Stone carries sound in ways wood does not. A man walking behind you may sound closer than he is, or farther away. If you turn too quickly, you announce yourself. If someone is following you, they want to know whether you have noticed them. Walk on. Let the sound reveal itself. Honest footsteps will eventually fall out of rhythm. Dishonest ones will not. Rule 5. Do not stop to speak beneath an unlit window. Windows are meant to glow at night. A dark window is a closed one. A lit window is an occupied one. An unlit window that feels occupied should be passed without comment. People inside unlit rooms are listening, and sometimes they are waiting to be addressed first. I learned that rule from a man named Osbert. He was older than me, with a crooked finger that never fully straightened after a fire years before. He walked his route carefully, tapping his lantern against his leg as he went, always humming softly. One night, He stopped beneath an unlit window. Just to listen, he said. Just to make sure. He turned his head slightly, leaned closer, and asked if anyone was inside. The window answered him, not with a voice, with breath. Osbert did not return to the watch. Rule 6. If a street seems shorter than it was the night before, slow your pace. This one is rarely written down. Streets do not shrink, but your sense of distance can. If you reach the end of a lane too quickly, do not continue at the same speed. Let the night correct itself. Men who rush through shortened streets often find themselves arriving somewhere they did not intend to patrol. Some never find their way back to a familiar road. By the second hour of watch, London grows quieter than most people realize. Dogs stop barking. Drunks either fall asleep or vanish into doorways. The city exhales. This is when the rules matter most. Rule 7. Never knock twice. If you must knock for a fire, for a disturbance, for a gate not yet secured, knock once and wait. A second knock is an invitation. If there is no answer to the first, move on. Anyone who needs help badly enough will call out. Anyone who answers the second knock is not answering you. Rule 8. If you hear a door open behind you, do not look back until you hear it close. Doors behave differently at night. They open easily, they close selectively. If a door opens behind you and does not close, it is because it is waiting to be acknowledged. Keep walking. A closed door announces itself, an open one does not. There are other rules, smaller ones, rules you learn only by walking long enough to notice patterns. Never count the people in the street after midnight. Never share your lantern flame. Never accept directions from someone who does not carry light. But those are refinements. The city tolerates refinements. It punishes confidence. Rule 9. Never answer a voice that calls you watchman. Your name may be known. Your title should not be. If someone addresses you by role rather than name, they are not speaking to you. They are testing whether the watch is present. Do not respond. Let the silence do the work. I followed every rule for years. I believed that knowing them was the same as being protected by them. I believed the city rewarded care. That was my mistake. The night I made my error did not begin badly. The bells rang correctly. The gates closed on time. My route felt familiar beneath my feet. Fog drifted in from the river, thin at first, then heavier, settling low along the street like a second ground. I adjusted my lantern and continued walking. I had done this 100 times before. It was the alley off Pudding Lane that unsettled me, not because it was unfamiliar, because it was too familiar. I reached its mouth sooner than I should have. I slowed, remembering Rule 6. I counted my steps. 1, 2, 3. The count felt eager, as though the space between steps had tightened. I should have turned away then. I did not. I told myself it was nothing. That tired men imagine patterns. That fog plays tricks with distance. I stepped into the alley, and for the first time in years, I broke a rule. Not deliberately, not boldly. I did something far worse. I hesitated. From somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the fog, a voice spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, just clearly enough to be understood. It spoke my name, correctly. I stopped walking. Only for a moment, only long enough to realize what I had done. And in that pause, that single human lapse, the city noticed me. The mistake was not that I stopped. The mistake was that I knew I had stopped. There is a difference. A man who stops without thinking can recover quickly. He blames distraction, shrugs it off, resumes his pace. The city forgives that kind of ignorance. It is common. It passes unnoticed. But when you stop knowing, you should not have, when the rules rise fully formed in your mind and you choose stillness anyway, the city takes note. I felt that recognition settle around me like fog. The alley off Pudding Lane was narrow, as it had always been. Brick walls rose close on either side, damp with age, their surfaces darkened by smoke and years of careless hands. The ground sloped slightly downward, just enough that rainwater collected at the far end, forming shallow pools that reflected lantern light poorly. I had walked it hundreds of times. That familiarity was the problem. The voice had spoken my name, not loudly, not with urgency, just clearly enough to be recognized. I stood still, lantern held low, its flame steady despite the damp air. The fog pressed close, softening edges, swallowing distance. The alley ahead was empty, or appeared to be. I told myself there were explanations. Someone had heard me called earlier. Someone knew my name from the watch. Someone was mistaken. Names travel easily in cities like this. That is what I told myself. Rule 1 pressed gently against my thoughts. If you hear your name spoken in the dark, do not answer. I did not answer. I had followed the rule. That should have been enough. So why did I remain standing there, my boots planted as though I were waiting for something else to happen? The truth is simple. I was embarrassed. Embarrassed by the idea that I had imagined it. Embarrassed by the thought of fleeing an empty alley. Embarrassed by the notion that I, a seasoned watchman, might be frightened by fog and sound. The city knows how to use pride. It lets you argue with yourself. I lifted the lantern slightly, not to search, but to reassure myself. The light pushed forward a little farther, revealing brick, shadow, and the faint glimmer of water pooled at the alley's end. Nothing moved, nothing waited. The fog did not thin, but it did not thicken either. I told myself that if someone had truly spoken, they would speak again. That was the second mistake. I took a single step forward, then another. Each footfall sounded louder than it should have, the stone beneath me responding too clearly, as though the alley were listening. I slowed my pace instinctively, my body remembering rules my mind was trying to ignore. Halfway down the alley, the air felt different. Not colder, still, as though the space had been sealed. Behind me, the fog shifted. I did not turn. Rule 4, but I felt the change all the same, a subtle tightening at the back of my neck, the sensation of being observed without direction. The lantern flame wavered once, then steadied again. I stopped, again. That was the third mistake. I told myself I was only listening. Listening is not the same as answering, I reasoned. Listening is not forbidden. That is how the city lures you, not by asking you to break rules outright, but by offering distinctions that feel reasonable in the moment. From behind me, a sound emerged, not footsteps, not breath, the faint scrape of leather against stone, a boot matching mine, not approaching, not retreating, standing where I had been standing moments before. My stomach tightened. Rule 4 says not to turn immediately. It does not say you may never turn. It assumes you will walk on first. I had not. I had stopped. Now the rules felt incomplete, like instructions missing their final line. I began walking again, slowly, deliberately, each step measured. The sound behind me followed, perfectly. We walked like that for several steps, me moving forward, the sound behind me repeating my pace exactly, not catching up, not falling behind, just mirroring. The alley felt longer now. I knew how far it should be. I had counted it unconsciously for years. It had never taken this long to reach the end. At the far end of the alley, The streets should have opened wide again, the air shifting, the fog loosening its grip. It did not. The alley continued. Straight, unbroken. I slowed. The sound behind me slowed. I stopped. It stopped. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like the moment before a bell rings. "This is foolish," I muttered quietly. The sound of my own voice startled me. The city prefers silence at night. I forced myself to resume walking, my pace firm now, controlled. I focused on the lantern, on the steady circle of light it cast ahead of me. Brick, stone, fog, nothing else. The scrape behind me faded gradually, as though released. I did not look back. I walked until the alley finally ended, or something like it did, and the street widened once more. The fog thinned, sound returned. Somewhere nearby, a door closed. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. I told myself it was over. I told myself I had let the night get inside my head. I told myself I would not make the same mistake again. That is what men always tell themselves. For a time, the watch returned to something like normal. I resumed my route, walking familiar streets in the correct order. I passed shuttered shops, sleeping houses, the occasional figure hurrying home before the bells. I corrected my pace. I kept my eyes forward. I followed the rules. And yet, something had changed. The city felt closer, not physically, attentively, as though my movements now mattered more than they had before, as though the streets were no longer indifferent to whether I passed through them or not. At the third bell of the night, I reached a small square where 3 streets met, a place I often paused just long enough to listen for disturbances. The square was empty, too empty. London is never entirely still, even at night. There is always something, a rat, a shifting shutter, a distant cough. Here, there was nothing. The lantern light stretched oddly, its edges softening more than usual. I resisted the urge to move on quickly. Rushing creates its own mistakes. From one of the streets leading into the square, a figure emerged. Slowly, deliberately. He walked without a lantern. That alone was wrong. He stopped just inside the edge of my light, close enough that I could see the outline of his coat, the shape of his boots, the tilt of his head. I could not see his face. The fog gathered there, thick and persistent, refusing to lift. "Watchman," he said. Not my name, my title. Rule 9. I did not answer. I did not acknowledge him. I shifted my stance slightly, angling my body as though preparing to continue my patrol. The figure did not move. "Late night," he said conversationally. "Still wrong. People do not make conversation with the watch at night unless they are trying to establish something." "I heard someone call out earlier," he continued. "Thought it might have been you." My heart beat once, hard. I said nothing. Silence is not empty. It does work. The figure tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something beyond me. "Strange," he said after a moment. "Sound carries oddly tonight." "Yes," I replied. The word slipped out before I could stop it. Just one word. Just enough. The fog shifted. The figure took one step forward. Not into my light. Closer to it, I felt the city draw a breath. "You shouldn't stop in alleys," he said mildly. "I didn't," I replied. "Another mistake. Explaining is a kind of answering." The figure smiled. I could hear it. A soft change in breath. A satisfaction. "Well," he said, "you did tonight." I moved. Not away. Forward. I stepped past him, deliberately, my shoulder brushing the edge of his coat. It felt wrong, not solid, like passing through damp cloth that was not attached to a body. I did not look back. I did not slow. I walked until the square was behind me and the streets resumed their familiar shapes. Only then did I realize what I had done. I had spoken twice. I had acknowledged him. I had allowed conversation to exist. The rules had not failed. I had. The rest of the watch passed without incident. No more voices. No more figures. The bells rang correctly. The fog thinned as dawn approached. Everything behaved that should have reassured me. It did not. Because when morning came and the city woke, I realized something quietly, with a heaviness that did not lift. The streets I had walked that night were the same, but my understanding of them was not. I had paused, I had listened, I had responded, and the city now knew I could. When I handed over my cloak at the end of watch, the man relieving me glanced at me briefly, then looked away. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. The word felt thin. As I walked home in the growing light, London felt ordinary again. Brick, stone, smoke, people, but beneath it all, I could feel the city holding something back. Not anger, not threat, interest. I should have kept walking. That was the rule beneath all the others, and I had broken it. The day after my mistake, London looked exactly as it always had. That is how it begins. The city does not reveal itself in daylight. In daylight it becomes brick and timber again, a place of markets and shouting, carts and coins, familiar quarrels and familiar smells. In daylight, everything has a reason. It is at night that London becomes something else. At night, it stops explaining itself. I slept poorly through the day, though I tried not to. I lay on my bed with my eyes closed, listening to life outside my window, letting the ordinary noise reassure me. The calls of sellers in the street, the clatter of a cart on stones, the quarrel of neighbors that had nothing to do with fog or bells. It should have been enough. But every time I drifted toward sleep, I heard it again in memory, that calm voice in the square calling me watchman, and my own foolish reply, slipping out like a coin dropped into water. A single word and a ripple spreading outward. When evening came, I prepared for watch, as I always did. I checked my cloak. I checked my lantern. I checked the small, ordinary tools of my work. I told myself the rules were still mine to follow. I told myself last night had been an error that could be corrected with discipline. That is what rules are for, I thought. To correct, the bells rang. Correctly, the gates were secured. The city quieted. I stepped into the streets with my lantern held low, my pace measured, my mind already counting the order of my route. The first street, then the alley beside the baker's shop, then the narrow lane past the cobbler, then the small square where 3 roads met. My body knew it better than my thoughts did. That should have been comfort. It wasn't. The fog arrived early. It always does. Sometimes, rolling in from the river like an animal that has learned the route. It creeps along the streets, pooling in low places, gathering in courtyards and alleys, turning lantern light into soft halos. Fog is not unusual, but this fog arrived too neatly. It did not drift. It placed itself. By the time I reached the first turn of my route, the edges of the street had softened. The far end of the lane was already blurred. My lantern flame seemed smaller than usual, as though the air itself were drinking the light. I adjusted the wick. The flame steadied. Still, it felt reluctant, like a man doing his duty without enthusiasm. I reminded myself of the rules. Begin early. Count bells yourself. Walk the same route in the same order. Never turn around quickly. Never knock twice. Never answer your title. Good rules, old rules, rules that had kept me safe. At the second street, something small went wrong. The cobbler's shop sat on the corner of the lane. I knew the doorway by the crack in its step and the crooked sign above it. Even at night, even in fog, it was a familiar shape. But when I reached the corner, the shop was not there. The building stood, yes, brick and timber as always, but the doorway was on the other side, as though someone had picked up the shop and turned it quietly while the sun was down. I stopped walking, only for a moment. Not to stare, not to investigate, to orient myself. That was how I justified it. I stepped closer, lifting the lantern slightly. The sign above the door still bore the cobbler's mark, carved and worn. The window still displayed the same dull shapes of boots and leather scraps. The shop was the shop, only its face had changed. I felt a dull pressure behind my eyes, like fatigue arriving too quickly. I resumed walking. 2 streets later, a lane that should have narrowed remained wide. Not greatly. Just enough that my footsteps sounded different, to open, to exposed. I glanced down and saw that the stones beneath my boots were cleaner, as though recently scrubbed. The street smelled faintly of damp earth instead of smoke. That alone was wrong. Streets in London smell of smoke at night. They are soaked in it. I slowed my pace. Rule 6. Though it belonged to the road outside the city, echoed inside my head, as if the rules were beginning to merge. If a street seemed shorter than it was the night before, slow your pace. This street didn't seem shorter. It seemed adjusted. In the square, the fog was thicker. The 3 roads met as they always had, but the space between buildings felt wider, as though the city had taken a single step backward to observe itself. I stood at the edge of my lantern light and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. The city held its breath. Behind me, somewhere in the fog, a door opened. A soft creak. I did not turn. Rule 8. If you hear a door open behind you, do not look back until you hear it close. I listened. The door did not close. I waited longer than was comfortable. Still no close. I forced myself to keep walking, moving forward into the next street, my eyes fixed ahead, my lantern steady. The open door remained a sound behind me, like a question left unanswered. A few minutes later, the door closed. Quietly, as if satisfied, I kept walking. My route should have taken me past a low wall where a woman sometimes left scraps for stray dogs. The dogs always gathered there at night, their shapes flickering at the edge of lantern light. Tonight, there were no dogs. The scraps remained untouched. That was not normal. In a city like London, everything is taken eventually. I walked on without slowing. At the end of the lane, I reached a corner where the street bent sharply. It always bent sharply. I could have walked it with my eyes closed. As I approached, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, measured, matching my pace exactly. Rule for rose in my mind: do not turn, walk on, let the rhythm reveal itself. So I walked. I took the corner, and the street did not bend. It continued straight, longer than it should have. For a moment, I thought I had taken the wrong turn, that I had misremembered, that my tired mind had placed the corner too early. But then I saw it. The wall that should have been on my left was now on my right. The houses that should have faced the river faced away from it. Everything was the same brick, the same shutters, the same smell of smoke, but arranged in the wrong order, like a prayer spoken backwards. My mouth went dry. I kept walking. This is the part that is difficult to explain to someone who has never worked the night watch. Because a city is not just buildings, it is repetition. It is the way you know the sound of your own street, the angle of familiar corners, the distance between one lamp and the next. You learn it without trying, and it becomes part of you. When that repetition breaks, it feels like losing your footing without falling, like stepping onto a stair that is not there. The footsteps behind me continued, still matching, still calm, still neither closer nor farther. I focused on my lantern, on my breath, on the steady rhythm of walking. I refused to acknowledge the sound. If I did not acknowledge it, perhaps it would remain only sound. The bell rang, one ring, wrong hour, close enough to vibrate in my teeth. I did not stop walking. I did not look for the source. I kept my pace steady, my eyes forward, my thoughts narrowed to a single intention. Keep walking. The street ahead grew longer, not stretched dramatically, just resistant. Each step felt like it carried me less distance than it should have. The lantern light seemed to reach shorter. The fog thickened in a way that felt deliberate, gathering in front of me rather than around me. I began counting my steps without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The count calmed me. 4, 5, 6. I could feel the footsteps behind me keeping time. 7, 8, 9. I did not look back. At 20, the street should have opened into a small courtyard. It did not. At 30, it should have passed a familiar drain grate that always caught my boot if I wasn't careful. It did not. At 40, my throat tightened. At 50, I realized the city was no longer testing whether I knew the rules. It was testing whether I would keep obeying them even when they stopped making sense. A figure appeared ahead, not emerging, not approaching, simply becoming visible as my lantern light reached it. It stood in the middle of the street, still and patient. It carried no lantern. That was wrong. It wore a cloak that looked like mine. That was worse. Rule 4 said do not turn quickly. Rule 9 said do not answer. Rule 6 said slow if the street changes. None of them told me what to do when the city placed something familiar in front of me and waited to see whether I would recognize it. I slowed. I did not stop. The figure lifted its head slightly, and I heard my voice. Not my name, my voice. Speaking softly from ahead, as if repeating something I had said earlier. A single word. Yes. The word I had spoken to the figure in the square the night before. The city had kept it, and now it was offering it back to me. My hands trembled slightly around the lantern, not with fear, with the effort of staying calm. I walked past the figure without looking at its face. My lantern held steady, my breath slow. As I passed, I felt a faint chill against my shoulder, like damp cloth brushing skin. The figure did not move. It did not follow. It simply remained where it had been placed, like a marker on a map. When I reached the end of the street, when the city finally allowed it to end, I found myself standing in a place I should not have been able to reach from that route. A different square, a different district. I knew it by the smell alone, the sharp attempts of the river, the damp wood of docks, the faint fish salt carried in the air. I had walked too far without walking far enough. My stomach tightened. I turned in a slow circle, taking stock of my surroundings. And for the first time that night, I realized something clearly. The city was not trying to lose me. It was trying to teach me that it could. I resumed walking, choosing a route that should lead back toward my assigned streets. But as I walked, I felt the roads under my feet adjusting again, settling, shifting by fractions. Not enough for a stranger to notice. Enough for me, because I was the one who walked them every night. And because I had made the mistake of answering. By the time the final bell neared, the fog began to thin. The streets returned to their familiar angles. The city relaxed. as if it had completed some quiet demonstration. I reached the end of my watch, physically intact, but my mind felt heavier because I understood something that chilled me more than any fog. The city had learned I could be spoken to, and now it was practicing. By the time my watch ended that morning, the city had returned itself to order. That is something London does very well. Fog thinned, streets resumed their expected shapes, shops opened, voices returned. In daylight, nothing I had seen the night before left a mark. That, I would learn, was not an accident. I slept later than usual, my body heavy with a tiredness that felt older than the hours I had walked. When I woke, the sounds of the city were already well established. The familiar arguments of sellers, the clatter of hooves, the shouted greetings of neighbors who pretended not to hear one another at night. I lay still for a while, listening. Everything sounded normal. It was only later, when I returned to the watch house to collect my cloak for the coming night, that I began to notice the absences. The watch house is not a place people linger. Men arrive, exchange brief words, take their gear, and leave. It smells of damp wool and oil, and the walls are marked with scratches from years of men leaning their spears against them. It is not a place where you expect things to change. Yet that day, the bench along the far wall was shorter. Not broken, not moved. Shorter, one space fewer than I remembered. I frowned and counted the hooks where cloaks were hung. One was empty. That, too, is not unusual. Men fall ill. Men miss shifts. Men leave the watch for better work. But this hook had not been removed. It had been worn, smooth, polished by use. Someone had hung their cloak there for years. And now there was nothing. "Where's Tom?" I asked, casually, as if the question did not matter. The man beside me paused longer than necessary before answering. "Transferred," he said. "To where?" He shrugged. "Different district." That was all. Tom had walked the river route. He was quiet, methodical, known for counting everything: steps, doors, windows, shadows. He never laughed when the rules were mentioned. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. I tried to picture him walking a different district. I could not. That night, as I stepped back onto the streets, the thought followed me like a loose thread. The city looked calm again. Fog drifted lightly, but not heavily. Bells rang correctly. My route behaved. And yet, every time I reached a familiar corner, I felt the absence of someone who should have been there. A lantern that did not glow where I expected. A step that did not echo alongside mine. A voice that did not mutter a greeting in passing. The watch had holes in it. By the second hour, I reached a long street that had once been patrolled by 3 of us together. We had spaced ourselves evenly, our lanterns forming a line of moving light that reassured everyone who saw it. That night, I walked it alone. The street felt wider than it should have. I kept my pace steady. I counted my steps. I did not allow myself to think about why the city seemed to prefer it this way. I began remembering other men, not all at once. They surfaced gradually as the city itself seemed to prompt the memories. There was Edwin, who used to hum as he walked, softly, tunelessly, always the same few notes. He said it helped him keep time. One night, he stopped humming. He did not stop walking. He simply forgot. After that, he walked faster than usual, as though trying to outrun something only he could hear. Edwin left the watch shortly after. No one ever said where he went. There was Martin, who insisted on knocking twice, no matter what the rules said. He laughed about it. Politeness, he called it. One night, he knocked twice on a door near the docks. The door opened and did not close. Martin did not return. The city remembers these men better than people do. That is the unsettling part. I passed places where I could still feel their habits lingering. A corner where someone always paused. A doorway where a lantern once lingered longer than necessary. These were not ghosts. They were patterns, and the city is very good at preserving patterns. Halfway through the night, I encountered a watchman I did not recognize. That alone was unusual. The watch is not large, and faces become familiar quickly. He walked toward me from the far end of the street, his lantern swinging in a controlled arc, his posture relaxed, too relaxed. We slowed as we approached one another, the way watchmen do. "Quiet night," he said. His voice was steady. "Normal, wrong, which route?" I asked. A simple question, a necessary one. He hesitated, just a fraction too long. "All of them," he replied. The lantern flame guttered. I felt the rules line up in my mind, one after the other, like doors closing gently. Never accept answers that are too broad. Never trust familiarity that arrives unearned. Never speak more than necessary. I nodded once and stepped past him. He did not turn to watch me go. But as I walked away, I felt something settle into place, like a piece fitting where another had been removed. Later, near the river, I found something that confirmed what I had begun to suspect. A lantern, set neatly against the wall, its flame extinguished, its glass unbroken. I recognized it immediately. Tomes, he had carved a small mark into the handle, a habit from his early days on the watch. The lantern was cold. It had not been dropped. It had been placed. I did not touch it. I did not move it. I continued walking. That, too, is a rule. Do not disturb objects that have chosen where to rest. As dawn approached, the city softened again. The fog lifted. The streets returned to their correct shapes. Bells rang their proper hours. Everything behaved. But I understood now what the city was doing. It was thinning the watch. Not violently, not suddenly. It was selecting. The men who joked about the rules went first. The men who tested them followed. The men who spoke when they should have remained silent lasted longer, but not forever. Those who remained were the ones who learned when not to answer. I reached the end of my route and stopped beneath a familiar archway, resting my lantern against the stone. For the first time since I had joined the watch, I felt certain of something I did not want to know. The city does not need many watchmen. It needs a few who understand it, and when it finds them, it keeps them. As the sun rose, I handed over my lantern and cloak. The man taking them paused, studying me with a look I had seen before. Not suspicion, not concern, but recognition. "You're settling in," he said. It was not a compliment. I walked home through streets that no longer felt entirely neutral. They were still brick, still stone, still real, but they watched me pass in a way they had not before, as though I were no longer just someone moving through them, as though I were part of the mechanism that kept them quiet at night. That was when I understood the truth beneath the rules. They are not meant to save everyone. They are meant to identify who stays. By the fifth night, I stopped thinking of the rules as protection. Protection is something you receive. A wall, a lock, a guard at a gate. The rules were none of those things. They were closer to alignment. Small acts performed in the correct order, at the correct time, to keep you fitting neatly inside the city's expectations. They did not shield you from the night. They taught you how to be tolerated by it. And once the city has tolerated you long enough, it begins to decide how useful you might be. The evening began quietly. The bells rang. The gates were secured. The city lowered its voice. I stepped out with my lantern and walked my route as I always had, the same streets, the same turns, the same pauses. I kept my pace measured. I did not rush. I did not look for trouble. The city is full of men who think trouble is something you can seek and defeat. The night watch teaches you otherwise. Trouble finds you when you are consistent enough to be found. In the first hour, everything behaved. Fog drifted, but it did not gather aggressively. The streets held their shapes. Doors remained shut. I almost believed the city had tired of testing me. That was my mistake. The city does not tire. It simply changes methods. At the second hour, I reached the long street where Tom used to patrol. The lantern hook in the watch house had been empty for days now. His lantern still sat by the river, untouched, as if waiting for a hand that would never return to lift it. I walked that street alone, my lantern casting a narrow path of light ahead of me. Halfway down, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, measured, matching. Rule for Rose in my mind, like a hand touching my shoulder. Do not turn immediately. So I did not. I kept walking as though I had heard nothing. The footsteps kept pace. After a time, the footsteps changed. Not in rhythm, in texture. They grew lighter, as though whoever made them had stepped onto a different surface, something softer than stone. And then, without any change in the distance behind me, they stopped. Not faded, stopped. As cleanly as a bell ending mid-ring. I did not turn. I continued to the end of the street, and only when I reached the next corner did I allow myself a slow glance back. The street was empty. It always is. When you finally look, that should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the city had simply proven that it could place sound wherever it wished. It had not needed a person. It had needed my attention, and it had received it. I resumed my route, repeating the rules in my mind, as if repetition could reinforce them. Never knock twice. Never speak your title. Never answer your name in darkness. Walk the same route. Count bells yourself. The rules were old. London was older. At the third bell, I passed a doorway that was open, not wide, just a crack, a thin slice of darkness, deeper than the rest of the street. I slowed instinctively, my body recognizing the wrongness before my mind fully formed it. Rule 8. If you hear a door open behind you, do not look back until you hear it close. But this door was ahead. There was no rule for that. I stood for a moment, lantern held low, the light licking at the edges of the opening. The door did not move. The street was silent. I could not hear breathing, could not hear movement inside. And yet I felt, distinctly, that something behind that door was aware of me. Not waiting, not hiding, simply aware. I did not knock. I did not speak. I walked past without quickening my pace. As I did, the door opened a little wider. No sound, just an increase in darkness. I kept walking. Behind me, the door did not close. A minute later, I heard a soft sound. Not a footstep, not a door. My lantern flame, a faint sputter, as though something had touched it. I glanced down. The flame had shrunk to a smaller, tighter point, still burning, but begrudgingly. I adjusted the wick. It did not brighten. I tried again. Still nothing. The lantern was not failing. It was being agreed with less. I walked on. By the time I reached the small square, the fog was thicker than it had been earlier. Not drifting placed. It gathered in the corners of the square and pooled at the base of buildings, turning the open space into something enclosed. I stopped at the edge of my lantern light and listened. Silence. Then, a voice, not calling, not speaking my name, simply speaking, as if continuing a conversation that had begun long ago. Watchman, it said softly. Rule 9. Never answer. So I did not. The voice sighed, a sound that felt like fog shifting. Then it spoke again. You're learning, it said. My chest tightened. Not fear, recognition, because the city does not praise. Praise is a hook. I took a single step forward, resuming my route as if nothing had happened. The voice did not follow. It did not need to. It had already placed something in my mind, like a coin slipped into a pocket. A sense of being observed with purpose. That was when the streets began to repeat. Not fully, not obviously, only enough to make my memory hesitate. I turned down a lane that should have led past the baker's shop, and there it was, the baker's shop, exactly as expected. Then, 2 streets later, I passed it again. Same crooked sign, same worn step, same faint smell of flour and old smoke. My stomach tightened. I slowed my pace. I did not stop. I forced myself to keep the route in my head, to anchor it by order rather than by landmarks. First street, second turn, third lane, square, archway, river path. Order is harder to rearrange than scenery. That was my hope. At the river, the air grew colder. Fog clung low to the water, swallowing reflections. The docks were mostly quiet at this hour, but never truly silent. Ropes creak, wood shifts, water moves. Tonight, the river made no sound. It lay still, as if waiting. I walked along the path beside it, lantern held low. And there, against the wall, was Tome's lantern, still, cold, placed. It had not moved, but it looked newer, not cleaner, newer, as if the years of handling had been smoothed away, as if it were becoming less his and more the city's. I stopped walking, only for a moment, only long enough to feel the weight of the realization settle into place. This was not a missing man's lantern. It was a marker, a reminder, a lesson. The city does not take you suddenly. It begins by taking your role, then your habits, then, finally, your name. As I resumed walking, I heard it. My name, spoken softly, from the fog near the river. Not shouted, not called, just spoken, casually, as if someone were testing how it felt to use it. I did not answer. I did not turn. I walked on. But my heart beat once, hard, and I felt the city notice that too. At that moment, I understood something important. I had believed the rules existed to keep me safe, but the city had begun to use the rules as a way to measure me, to see whether I would obey without needing to be told, to see whether I would respond when spoken to see whether I would keep walking even when the streets repeated, even when the river went silent, even when my lantern refused to shine brightly. The rules were no longer protection, they were preparation. Near the final bell, I reached a street that should have taken me directly to the watch house. I knew it well. I could have walked it blind. I turned into it, and the street grew longer. Not subtly, not by a fraction, by enough that my breath changed, by enough that my legs began to ache. The buildings on either side were familiar, but they did not pass by at the correct pace. It felt like walking through a memory that refused to end. I began counting my steps. 1, 2, 3. The number settled my mind. 4, 5, 6. The street did not shorten. 7, 8, 9. The lantern flame shrank, smaller. 10, 11, 12. A bell rang. Wrong hour. Close. My ribs vibrated. I kept walking. Somewhere ahead, in the fog, I saw a figure. A watchman, cloak, lantern, measured stride. It could have been anyone. It could have been me. I slowed. Rule 6 in my mind, not quite belonging here but present all the same. If the street changes, slow down. If you see yourself, slow down. The figure walked steadily ahead, never turning, never acknowledging me. Its lantern did not cast light. It carried the shape of a lantern, not the function. I did not catch up. I did not call out. I let distance remain. The street, after a time, finally ended. The fog thinned. The city loosened its grip as dawn approached, as if satisfied it had taught me what it wished to teach. When I reached the watch house, I handed in my lantern and cloak. My hands were cold, my eyes heavy. The man inside barely glanced up. "Quiet night?" he asked. "Yes," I said. The word tasted wrong. As I walked home through the lightning streets, the city returned itself to daylight, brick and timber and noise. But inside me, something remained. A calm understanding. I was still walking, I was still obeying, and the city had begun to count on that. There is a moment, if you walk the night long enough, when the city stops testing you, not because you have passed, but because it has decided you are no longer uncertain. That moment does not arrive with bells or voices or fog thick enough to mark it clearly. It comes quietly, in the way habits form, unnoticed until they are already part of you. I reached that moment without realizing it had happened. The night began without tension. That, more than anything, should have warned me. The bells rang on time. The fog drifted lightly, careless rather than deliberate. Doors remained closed. Streets kept their familiar shapes. London felt satisfied. I stepped out onto my route with my lantern held low and my pace even, and for the first time in days, my thoughts did not run ahead of my feet. I was simply walking. I noticed then how little effort it took. My body knew the city better than my mind did. My turns came without conscious thought. My pauses happened in the right places. I slowed where slowing was needed, quickened where the street allowed it. The rules no longer felt like rules. They felt like posture, like breathing. At the first hour, I passed a new watchman, young, narrow-shouldered. His lantern shook slightly as he walked, the way all new watchmen's lanterns do. He nodded to me quickly, eyes flicking away, as though embarrassed to be seen watching. I recognized that look. It is the look of someone still trying to prove he belongs. "Quiet night," he said. "Yes," I replied. He hesitated, then asked, "Anything I should know?" The question was too broad, too hopeful. I considered him for a moment longer than politeness required. "Keep walking," I said finally. He frowned. "What do you mean?" I shook my head gently. "Just keep walking." I did not explain. He nodded uncertainly and moved on. I watched him go until he disappeared around a bend. I did not expect to see him again. This is how the city takes. Not with violence, not with sudden disappearance, with responsibility. With the quiet understanding that you could explain but choose not to. Because explanation invites argument, and argument wastes time. As the night deepened, I realized something else had changed. The city was no longer showing me things. No repeating streets, no misplaced buildings, no voices testing my attention. It had stopped demonstrating its power. It no longer needed to, at the square where I had once spoken out of turn. The fog thinned as I approached, revealing the 3 streets meeting cleanly, precisely where they should. The stone beneath my boots felt solid, unquestionable. I stopped at the edge of the square and listened. The city did not hold its breath. It moved around me as though I were part of it, not an intrusion, not a problem to be solved. That was when the real understanding settled in. I was no longer being watched. I was being included. I thought of Tom, of Edwin, of the others whose lantern hooks now sat empty in the watch house. They had not failed, they had simply transitioned. They had learned too much too quickly, or spoken too freely, or resisted the shape the city required of them. London does not destroy those men, it reassigns them. Near the river, I passed the place where Tome's lantern had rested for so many nights. It was gone, not broken, not discarded. Gone, the stone wall was bare, unmarked, as though the lantern had never been there at all. I felt a small, sharp pang of something like loss, followed by understanding. The marker was no longer needed. The river flowed again, softly, naturally. Its sound returned to the background where it belonged. That, too, was a sign. I continued my patrol without incident. Hours passed without distortion. Streets did not lengthen. Fog behaved. Bells rang only when they should. This was the reward. Not safety, predictability. When the final bell approached, I felt no urgency, no relief, just the quiet sense that the night had been completed correctly. I returned to the watch house and hung my cloak on its hook. I noticed, without surprise, that another hook was empty now, the one that had belonged to the young watchman. No one mentioned it, no one ever does. As I walked home in the pale light before dawn, I thought about what the city had taken from me. It had taken my curiosity. It had taken my need to understand. It had taken my desire to test or question. And in return, it had given me something steadier. Belonging. The city does not care about names. It cares about function. It needs gates watched, streets walked, rules followed without hesitation. Those who can do that without needing explanation are valuable. Those who cannot are educational. I slept deeply that day, dreamless. When I woke, I could not remember the sound of my own name spoken in the dark. I could remember the rules. I could remember the routes. I could remember exactly how the city feels beneath your feet when it has accepted you. That evening, as I prepared for another watch, I realized something that did not frighten me at all. I no longer wondered whether I should continue. The choice had already been made, not by force, by alignment. I stepped out as the bells rang, my lantern steady, my pace measured. The city opened itself to me, and for the first time, I understood the truth beneath all the rules. They are not meant to save you. They are meant to shape you into something the city can rely on. I walked my route, I did my duty, and the city, in its vast, quiet way, let me. The last rule is not spoken aloud in the watch house. It is not written on the wall, not whispered over ale, not passed from one man to the next with a solemn look, as though words could keep a person intact. The last rule is learned through repetition, through silence, through the moment you realize you have stopped asking questions, not because you are satisfied, but because asking no longer feels like your role. I learned it the night I began teaching without meaning to. London at night is a different city. By day, it is a place of names. Men call out to one another. Sellers announce their goods. Children shout. Horses and carts and arguments fill every corner with sound. Even the river seems louder in daylight, as though it enjoys being seen. But at night, London becomes a place of function. Doors are meant to be shut. Fires are meant to be controlled. Streets are meant to be walked. And watchmen are meant to keep moving. That night began in calm. The bells rang on time. The fog drifted in a way that looked natural. The gates were secured. People hurried indoors before curfew and left the streets to those whose work required them. I stepped out with my lantern and followed my route without thought. Not because I was careless, because the city had made care automatic. In the first hour, I passed the same corner where the cobbler's shop had once turned itself to face the wrong way. It sat now as it always had, doorway in its rightful place, sin hanging crookedly, window dull and familiar. The street smelled of smoke and damp wool. Everything behaved. That was the first sign. The city behaves when it is satisfied. I walked on, my pace steady, my lantern held low. The rules moved through my mind like a quiet rhythm. Begin on time. Count bells yourself. Walk the route in order. Do not turn too quickly. Do not knock twice. Do not answer your title. Do not speak more than necessary. And beneath them all, the rule that had always been there but had never been named: keep walking. Near the second bell, I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, measured, matching. I did not feel fear. I did not even feel surprise. I simply did what I had trained myself to do. I kept walking. The footsteps followed for a while, then faded cleanly, like a lesson concluded. I did not look back. There was no need. At the square, the fog pooled in the corners but did not press into the center. My lantern light held its shape. The stones beneath my boots felt real, unquestionable. I stopped at the edge of the square out of habit, not to listen for trouble, but to mark time in my own body. It was then that I saw him, a young man, stepping into the square from the far street. Lantern swinging too widely, his posture stiff with the effort of appearing confident. A new watchman, his eyes flicked to the fog, then to my lantern, then to the empty streets, as though expecting something to announce itself. He looked like I had looked. That is what made my chest tighten. Not fear, recognition. He approached cautiously, then stopped at the edge of my light. "Quiet night?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," I said. He hesitated. A pause, too long, filled with unspoken questions. Then he asked the question that all new watchmen ask eventually, in one form or another. "Is it true," he said, "about the rules?" I watched him for a moment. His lantern flame flickered. His hand tightened round the handle. He was afraid not of the city, not yet, but of appearing foolish. That is where most mistakes begin. "It's true enough," I replied. "What happens if you don't follow them?" he asked. The question was honest and dangerous, because it invited explanation, and explanation invites testing. I felt the city's attention shift slightly, like fog leaning, not threatening, listening. I could have told him everything. I could have spoken of streets that repeat and doors that open without closing. I could have described how the city learns your voice, how it keeps your words like tokens. I could have told him about lantern hooks left empty and men transferred to districts no one can name. I could have told him all of it, and doing so would have endangered him more than silence ever could. So I did what the older watchman had done to me. I gave him a fragment. "Keep walking," I said quietly. He frowned. "That's it." I nodded once. "If you remember nothing else," I said, "remember that." He opened his mouth to ask another question, and at that exact moment, somewhere in the fog, a bell rang. One ring, wrong hour. The young watchman flinched. His eyes widened. He turned his head slightly, listening, trying to locate the sound. He was about to step toward it. Without raising my voice, without urgency, I spoke again. "Don't chase it," I said. He froze. "What?" he whispered. "Don't chase it," I repeated, calm and even, "and don't answer anything that calls you watchman." He swallowed. He nodded. He tried to laugh, but the sound didn't form properly. The city does that sometimes, steals laughter when it isn't useful. We stood in silence until the fog loosened and the bell's wrongness faded into the ordinary sounds of night. Then, without further conversation, the young watchman stepped away and continued his patrol. He did not look back. That was good. I remained at the square for a moment longer than usual, not because I was waiting, but because I understood what had just happened. I had passed on a rule, not as instruction, as containment, just enough to keep him walking, not enough to make him feel safe. That is how the rules survive. That is how the watch survives. That is how the city remains quiet at night. As I resumed my route, London seemed to settle around me, comfortable and predictable. Streets held their shape, doors stayed closed, the fog drifted like fog should drift. Everything behaved because the city had received what it wanted. Not obedience, participation. The rest of the night passed without incident. I walked, I listened, I did not answer. My lantern flame remained steady, neither shrinking nor flaring, as if it had agreed to be useful again. Near dawn, I passed the watch house and glanced at the hooks on the wall through the open door. One hook was empty, a familiar one. I did not stop to count. I did not need to. As the sky began to pale, I understood the last rule clearly, as though it had been carved into my bones. The final rule is this: if you learn the rules, you must pass them on, not to save everyone, to keep the system balanced, to ensure the city has enough watchmen who understand when not to speak, enough men who keep walking, because if you do not pass the rules on, the city will take what it needs anyway. It will simply take it from someone unprepared, and the streets will grow quieter, and the hooks in the watch house will grow emptier, and the city will continue to be itself at night. Dawn arrived, the fog thinned, London became a place of names again. People emerged from their homes, yawning, arguing, laughing, busy with small concerns that felt enormous in daylight. I handed in my lantern and cloak. The man behind the bench nodded. "Quiet night?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and for once, the word felt true, not because nothing had happened, because everything had happened the way it was meant to. As I walked home, the city looked ordinary, brick, stone, smoke, but I could feel the night beneath it, resting, waiting, and I knew that when darkness returned, the rules would return too. Not because the city needed to threaten anyone, because it needed the right people to keep moving through it. So if you ever find yourself in London at night, truly at night, when the last bell has rung and the streets have settled into their quiet shape, remember this: if you hear your name spoken in the dark, do not answer. If you hear the wrong bell, do not chase it. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn too quickly. And if a street feels longer than it should, slow down. Most importantly, keep walking, because the city does not take the ones who are brave. It takes the ones who stop.